He just wanted to buy bread. But when he saw a mother being humiliated at the checkout, he made a decision that would change his life forever. What started as a simple gesture turned into the greatest love of his life. John Walker walked through the glass corridors of the 27th floor of the Walker & Sons building, his face reflected in multiple surfaces that seemed to multiply his loneliness. Chicago stretched out before him like a sea of opportunities that paradoxically no longer excited him. At 38, he was one of the most influential men in the construction industry in the United States, known for the coldness with which he led meetings and the precision with which he discarded what he considered unnecessary. His dark suit seemed to weigh more on that sultry afternoon, while he loosened his tie as if trying to free something more than just his collar. "I need something different today," he muttered, staring at the elevator mirror. For the first time in years, he dismissed the driver and went down to the garage alone, as if the simple act of driving his own car could restore a forgotten part of himself. He drove aimlessly through the city's avenues, passing through quiet squares and neighborhoods he rarely looked at closely. Chicago looked different to him if he wasn't in a hurry. When he saw a neighborhood supermarket, one of those with faded awnings and slovenly carts at the entrance, John impulsively braked. He didn't need anything. He didn't want anything. But something about the simplicity of the place called to him. He parked the car and went inside. There was something almost therapeutic about the sound of the wheels of a metal cart, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the aloofness of the ordinary faces. For a moment, he stopped being the billionaire businessman and blended in with that anonymous crowd. He picked up random items, a cheddar cheese, artisanal bread, a bottle of cheap red wine. Nothing that was on his shopping list. In fact, he didn't even have one. This was a purchase made by someone who wanted to feel human. In the baby products aisle, he stopped in front of a shelf with diapers. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he'd never bought one. Maybe because he'd never thought about the possibility of needing them. Beside him, a young woman was pushing a stroller with a baby in her arms who was sleeping wrapped in a light blue blanket. She had brown hair tied with a simple elastic band, tired skin, but an attentive gaze. She dressed discreetly and looked at the price of the packages with the seriousness of someone who counts every penny. John didn't understand why his eyes were fixed on that image. There was a painful serenity about her, like one of those sad songs you hear over and over without knowing why. She continued in silence, but something about her presence kept echoing inside him. Minutes later, in the checkout line, he saw the same woman in front of him. She was rummaging through her wallet, her face slowly blushing. "I'll need to return a few items," she said, embarrassed, pointing to the baby formula and the package of diapers. The cashier nodded with an understanding but impersonal look. John watched everything in silence, with an uneasiness in his chest that he couldn't explain. When it was his turn, he held out a black card on the counter and said, "Include her products, please." The woman turned around, surprised and offended. "I don't accept charity," she said firmly, her eyes hard. John kept his tone calm, almost affable. "Consider it a birthday present, or a gesture from someone who has needed help too." She hesitated, but eventually accepted it silently. He noticed the name written on the name tag hanging from her purse. Sarah. Sarah clutched the bag with the diapers and formula to her chest, as if she were holding not products but her dignity. She left the supermarket without looking back, her shoulders tense and her steps quick. Once on the sidewalk, she took a deep breath, trying to digest what had just happened. The light afternoon wind blew strands of hair into her face, but she didn't care. A few meters away, leaning against a tree with his hands in his pockets, John watched her from a respectful distance. "Did you follow me?" she asked, raising an eyebrow suspiciously. John shook his head slowly. "Actually, I was going to leave, but I saw you leaving so quickly. I thought maybe you wanted to give me back the products." Sarah crossed her arms, adjusted the baby in her lap, and answered firmly, "I don't like to owe anyone anything. John smiled, but it was a restrained, almost sad smile. Then give it back to me in conversation, that's all. There's a snack bar right there. Reluctantly, Sarah looked at little Ethan, sleeping on her chest. The boy was as light as a promise and as heavy as the world. She wasn't used to accepting invitations, especially from strangers. But something in that man's voice, firm but restrained, aroused more curiosity than in threat. They walked to the coffee shop on the corner, where John ordered 2 coffees and an orange juice. They sat at a table far away, with a view of the street and the sun filtering through the trees. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off Ethan, who was sleeping peacefully in the makeshift stroller. "You seem like a strong woman to me," John said, breaking the silence carefully. "But I also see tiredness in your eyes. Where does all that weight come from?" Sarah hesitated, and after a few seconds, she answered in a low but firm voice, "From not having anyone to share it with, from having to decide everything alone, from not being able to make mistakes." John listened as if he wanted to understand, not just respond. His eyes were non-judgmental, and that surprised her. "I'm a music teacher," she continued. "I teach private lessons, but after Ethan was born, it was hard to keep up with the schedule. His father disappeared. When he found out I was pregnant, he said he needed time. He still needs it to this day." John remained silent, but his expression hardened slightly. "And you never heard from him again?" "I got a text when Ethan was born. That's all. He never answered my attempts after that." She laughed bitterly. "But it's okay. We learn to live without people who don't want to be with us." John rested his elbows on the table and said sincerely, "You talk about your difficulties without playing the victim. That's rare and admirable." Sarah just nodded. For the first time, in a long time, she felt like she was being truly heard. The coffee cooled in the cups as time stood still in that unlikely encounter. John said little, but his questions came with the precision of someone who has learned to observe. "Do you have somewhere to leave Ethan when you teach?" "Sometimes my neighbor looks after him, other times I take him with me. It's not ideal, but it's what I have." John seemed to think for a few moments. His eyes turned to the baby, who was now mumbling softly in his sleep. "At my company, we have a social project with children. There's a community center with music rooms. We need someone to help with the classes. It's only a few hours a week. And you can take Ethan." Sarah looked at him as if she were trying to decipher a trap. "You don't even know me." John smiled, but this time there was sweetness in the smile. "But I heard you talk about music, and that was enough." Sarah was silent for a few seconds, processing what she had heard. The community, the center, the job offer, the possibility of a new beginning. It all seemed out of reach, almost unreal. Her fingers drummed on the coffee cup as she tried to gather her thoughts. "And what makes you trust a stranger you met in line at the supermarket so much?" John shrugged lightly, but his answer was firm. "Maybe because I feel like a stranger in my own life too. You spoke so truthfully, and I haven't heard such truths in a long time." Sarah frowned, puzzled. "But why? You seem to have it all." John took a deep breath, staring out the window at the street. "Everything money can buy, yes, but what about the things money can't buy? Peace, for example. Purpose. Someone who will look me in the eye without wanting to make a deal." Those words touched a raw nerve in Sarah, and for a moment she let her guard down. "You sound like you're tired, but not from working. Tired of pretending." John stared at her in surprise, and after a few seconds, he laughed. Not a full-on laugh, but a real laugh. "You have a quick read on people, don't you?" Sarah gave a half smile. "Life teaches you. When you raise a child alone, you learn to pick up on what's not said. You learn to tell when someone is really listening to you, and when they're just waiting for their turn to speak." John nodded in agreement, impressed. "Then you know I'm not here to sound generous. I'm here because you've reminded me of things I've buried." "Like what?" she asked. He took a moment before answering. "Like music. Like the desire to do something that matters. Like the desire to build, not just buildings, but something that lasts inside me too. Time passed and they didn't even notice. The sun was already low on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of amber and lilac. Ethan woke up with a soft whimper, and Sarah picked the boy up in her arms with an automatic, tender gesture. John watched the scene with a kind of silent reverence. How old is he? 8. And each day seems like a new challenge. But I wouldn't change a thing. She adjusted the baby's body against her chest and looked at John. Do you have children? The question caught him off guard, and he answered with an almost imperceptible sigh. No. And to be honest, I never imagined myself having any. Not in the right way, at least. I always thought my life was too busy, too disorganized, too empty. Sarah observed him carefully, as if analyzing an open wound. And now, John smiled at the corner of his mouth. Now, I wonder if there's still time to fill what was left empty. As Sarah cradled Ethan in her arms, John pulled a black card from his pocket and slid it discreetly across the table. This is the address of the community center. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon with the coordinator. We can talk more if you want. And if you don't, that's fine too. You don't have to call me or thank me. But it would be nice to hear you play. Sarah took the card hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the gold embossing of the letters. I don't have a piano anymore. I stopped playing after I got pregnant. Lessons got expensive and, well, priorities change. John looked at her softly. You didn't stop being a musician just because you don't have a piano at home. The music is still there, in the way you rock your son, in the way you choose your words. You play, Sarah, even when you're silent. She looked away, feeling an unexpected thrill building in her chest. Tomorrow, maybe I'll come by. The next morning, Sarah woke up before her alarm, with the black card resting next to her notebook, like a silent presence reminding her of what had happened the day before. Ethan was still asleep, his arms open like someone in a light dream, oblivious to the world of decisions that were going through his mother's head. Sarah walked through the small house with its old tiles and worn furniture and looked at the shelf where her keyboard used to be. He had sold it months ago to pay the rent. Can I still play? She whispered to herself, as if she feared hearing the answer. She had spent the day divided between her chores, her online classes with impatient children, and Ethan's bottles. But as the clock approached 3 in the afternoon, a restlessness began to take hold of her chest. She felt that if she didn't go to that community center, she might be closing a door to something bigger than a job. She dressed in her most presentable clothes, a light blue blouse and dark pants that were starting to fray at the hem. Ethan rode in the stroller, comfortably seated, with a fabric toy in his hands. The neighborhood where the community center was located was another world. Restored buildings, clean squares, a central fountain surrounded by trees that shaded the marble benches. When she arrived, she hesitated at the glass door. She saw her reflection and thought, "What am I doing here?" But then, when she looked up, she saw John coming toward her, with the sleeves of his shirt rolled up and a slight smile on his face. "You came," he said, as if confirming something precious. Sarah forced a smile, still suspicious. "I didn't promise I would come. I just said maybe." He stepped aside unhurriedly. "Maybe is all we need to get started." The interior of the community center was more beautiful than she had imagined. There were murals painted by the children themselves, hallways with hanging drawings, instruments arranged in a glass-enclosed room. The project coordinator, a gray-haired woman named Teresa, welcomed Sarah warmly. "John told me about you. We have music initiation classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and a singing class on Saturdays. The children here don't need perfect technique. They need affection, someone to teach them to listen to themselves." Sarah was silent, her eyes scanning the space with a mixture of admiration and fear. Teresa smiled. "Do you want to try the piano? It's over there in the acoustic room." John made a discreet gesture, as if offering sacred territory. Sarah entered the room, her heart pounding. She sat down in front of the piano, ran her fingers delicately over the keys, and without realizing it, began to play the first few chords of a song she used to teach her young students. The music invaded the space softly, as if it occupied a place that had been waiting for it for a long time. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she heard the notes come to life under her fingers. Ethan, on John's lap, reacted with smiles and claps. Teresa listened from the doorway, moved, and John, standing at the back of the room, seemed to see something being reconstructed before him. When she finished, he fell silent, his eyes fixed on the keyboard. "It's been years since I played. I thought I had forgotten." John approached with slow steps and sat down next to her on the bench. "You didn't forget. You were just waiting for the right moment to remember." Sarah looked at him with a mix of vulnerability and strength. "Strange to feel hope again." John nodded. "The strange thing is living without it." That night, back in her small apartment, Sarah put Ethan to bed with a new tenderness in her hands. Something had changed inside her, and not just because she had found the piano again or heard the sound of her own courage. It was as if a forgotten part of herself had awakened. When the boy finally fell asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. The curiosity she had been avoiding since the supermarket was now beating strongly. She typed John Walker Chicago into the search field, and within seconds, a flood of results appeared. Magazine covers, interviews on business channels, awards, astronomical figures. Her heart raced. An article in a financial portal called him the visionary of Chicago's urban reconstruction. Another said that his fortune was enough to buy small cities. Sarah leaned back in her chair, stunned. "And here I thought he was just nice," she muttered, still trying to connect the man from the coffee shop with the tycoon in the headlines. The next day, after hours of brooding, Sarah made a decision. She called the number on the back of the card John had given her. She was answered by a secretary, but quickly transferred. John's voice rang clear on the other end, with a hint of surprise and restrained joy. "Sarah, it's good to hear from you. I thought you might have been scared." "Actually, I was scared," she said bluntly. "I found out who you are, and I wonder why someone like you would be interested in someone like me." There was a pause on the other end. "Because you looked me in the eye like no executive has in years. Because you didn't flinch at my name, and because your music touched me more than any recent investment." She took a deep breath. "Did you mean the job?" "Every word. If you want, come downtown tomorrow. We can talk more and play more." The next afternoon, Sarah returned to the community center, her feelings raw. This time there was a mixture of distrust and fascination in her steps. John greeted her with a serene look, as if he had been waiting for her, with the patience of someone who understands times of pain. They sat in the back garden, where the children played under the shade of the trees. "I grew up believing that people like you lived in another world," she said, looking at her hands. "And I grew up right. I really did. A world full of numbers, goals, endless meetings, until I started forgetting my own name outside of my name tag." John pointed to Ethan, who was playing with colored cubes. "He knows your name, and that's more than most people do." Sarah smiled sweetly, her eyes brimming with tears. "And he doesn't know anything about the world. He only feels when someone is present. That's what matters," John added in a low voice. "Presence is a luxury that money never gave me." The rest of the afternoon passed with a new lightness. Sarah gave her first test lesson, teaching 3 girls to identify musical notes with the help of colored bells. John watched from afar, almost hypnotized by the way she explained, smiling, kneeling beside the children. When she finished, she approached him, her face still flushed and her eyes shining. "I think I did well." John nodded sincerely. "You were born for this." "And you?" she teased with a slight smile. "Were you born to offer me jobs?" John stared at her for a few seconds, and then answered, his voice low and full of something that bordered on confession. "Maybe I was born to find what I was missing, and yesterday you showed me a part of that." Sarah didn't answer, but at that moment, as she looked at him, she felt something break inside her. It wasn't sudden passion, but the birth of a new confidence, something still shy, but real. The weeks that followed were stitched together with small gestures, as if life, for the first time in a long time, had decided to move along at the pace of delicacy. John began to visit the community center discreetly, almost as if he didn't want to break the spell of the simple routine created there. I wasn't going as a businessman, but as someone who was learning to listen again. He watched Sarah's classes from afar, sitting in the back of the room or next to Ethan, who seemed to have adopted him with a spontaneous affection. The boy laughed whenever John pretended to play the trumpet or clapped his hands out of rhythm. At one of these moments, Sarah, watching them together, murmured to herself, "It's almost like he was already here before he met you." And there was truth in that. John fit into that small reality with a naturalness that surprised him. It was as if he was learning to breathe again, without the shackles of his position or million-dollar decisions. One afternoon after school, Sarah was surprised by John as she was leaving. He was carrying 2 bags with sandwiches from a local deli and some homemade grape juice. "I don't like eating alone," he said with a shy smile. "And I know you never eat improperly." She laughed, touched by the attention, and accepted his invitation. They sat on a bench in the square in front of the center, with Ethan sleeping in the stroller next to her. Between bites and shy laughs, the conversation flowed with a lightness that didn't require masks. Sarah told stories about her classes, about the children's unusual questions, about the difficulties of teaching when you're emotionally exhausted. John, in turn, spoke of his youth, of how he lost his father early, and threw himself into business as if trying to overcome the pain with each spreadsheet. "My father used to say that you have to build something worth living in," he said. "But I built skyscrapers, and I never went inside my house." Sarah looked at him in silence, holding back the words, as if holding back a secret. That night, John dropped her off at her front door as he had done before, but something was different. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was charged, tender, a pause between 2 truths that had yet to be spoken. He got out of the car, gently lifted Ethan from his seat, and helped her up the few steps to the building. Sarah stood there for a moment, key in hand, the boy already fast asleep in her arms. She looked at John with a hesitant gleam in her eyes and said quietly, "Would you like to come in for a while?" He smiled, surprised but softly. "Only if I have tea." She laughed, opening the door. "I have tea, and maybe something you're not used to." Silence without demands. John walked in slowly, almost reverently, as if he were stepping not only into another physical space, but into an emotional territory where none of his masks made sense. The living room was dimly lit. Ethan was carefully placed in the makeshift crib in the bedroom. Sarah returned to the living room to find John sitting on the couch, his hands clasped on his knees, looking at one of the children's drawings pinned to the wall. She sat down next to him with 2 cups of tea, and for a few minutes they shared a silence that asked for no explanation. "You bring me peace, John. It scares me." He turned to her, his face just inches away. "And you give me truth. It saves me." What happened next was not rushed nor dramatic. It was slow, as if time held its breath. Their faces came closer gently, and finally their lips touched in a tender kiss, restrained, but full of something that words cannot convey. Sarah felt her defenses crumble one by one, and John, for the first time in years, kissed without the rush of conquering, just to feel. The night went on with the same gentleness. Nothing there was rushed, nothing was obligatory. Just 2 people tired of pretending, who had found a gap in time to belong to each other. John kissed her with a slowness that seemed to ask permission with each gesture, and Sarah responded with the confidence of someone who, even hurt, still chose to feel. They made love without a script, without urgency, with the surrender of someone who builds something delicate, piece by piece. And then they lay side by side on the worn mattress of the single bed, with Ethan sleeping in the next room, while the world seemed suspended outside. Sarah caressed his chest with her fingertips silently, until she murmured, "The last time someone slept here was before Ethan was born." John looked at her tenderly. "Then maybe it's time to change what this house reminds us of." At dawn, soft light entered through the crack in the curtains, discreetly, touching their faces. John was already awake, watching Sarah sleep, her hair falling over the pillow and her face serene, as if for the first time in a long time she had truly rested. He got up silently, made coffee using the simple coffee maker in the kitchen, and left a handwritten note on the table. "I went to the 9 a.m. meeting, but I'll be back for lunch, if you let me." Sarah woke up a few minutes later and found the note with a smile on her lips. She sat at the table with Ethan on her lap, drinking the still hot coffee, feeling that for the first time in many years, the day was beginning with a promise that was not just survival, but presence, and perhaps love. That same afternoon, after lunch shared with shy smiles and hands that naturally met on the table, Sarah decided to go to the park with Ethan. John had returned to the office to take care of urgent matters, but he had promised to return at dusk. The sky was clear, and the air had that spring freshness that seemed to lull unto hope. Ethan was laughing on the swing, and Sarah, sitting on the bench under a tree, felt strangely at peace. It was then that he heard a voice coming from behind, a voice she hadn't heard in almost 2 years, but still recognized as if it were an echo of something unresolved. "Sarah?" She turned slowly, her body stiffening like armor being reactivated. And there he was, Richard, Ethan's biological father, longer hair, clean-shaven, slightly embarrassed eyes, wearing an impeccable white shirt that seemed to clash with the man who had abandoned her pregnant. It took her a few seconds to react. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just stood there with a surprised Ethan in her arms, as if she wanted to protect him from the past that was resurfacing. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold and low. Richard put his hands in his pockets, visibly uncomfortable. "I went back to Chicago. I heard from acquaintances that you were teaching at a community center, and I heard about Ethan." Sarah took a step back. "You knew about Ethan from the day he was born. You just chose to disappear." He tried to get closer, but she held up her hand. "Not now. Not here." Richard took a deep breath. "I made a mistake. I was lost. But I want to know him. I want to be a father." Those words hit her like a silent punch. Her knees felt weak inside, but she stood her ground. Being a father isn't showing up after 2 years and saying you want to be one. Being a father is being there every day. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. John noticed the change in her expression as soon as he arrived. She was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, her gaze distant. "Did something happen?" he asked, approaching her carefully. She nodded, but took a while to speak. "Richard's back." The name came out bitter, as if it still burned her tongue. John sat down next to her, respecting the silence. "He looked for me in the park. He said he wants to meet Ethan. He said he wants to be a father." John was silent for a few seconds, then asked calmly, "And you? How do you feel about this?" Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm scared. Ethan doesn't know who he is. And I built everything by myself. Now he shows up and wants to come in, as if all I had to do was ask." John put his hand over hers. "You don't have to decide anything on your own. I'm here, not as someone who wants to replace you, but as someone who already loves you both." In the days that followed, Richard insisted on sending messages. He asked to see his son, saying he was willing to talk, to get closer little by little. Sarah felt torn between her protective instinct and her desire to resolve the situation in the fairest way possible. John, in turn, stayed by her side, without pressuring her, but making it clear that he was willing to face whatever was necessary. On a particularly difficult afternoon, Sarah confided, "I'm afraid that Ethan will mess everything up." I'm afraid of losing what I've built with you." John held her face with both hands and said firmly, "You won't lose me because of him, and Ethan will understand that you were there when he needed you most. Love is not imposed. Love is shown, day after day." John's words enveloped her like a warm hug, and for the first time since meeting Richard again, Sarah cried, not out of fear, but out of relief that she was no longer alone in that choice. As Sarah struggled to find a balance between the past that was returning and the present she was building with John, a new kind of storm was beginning to gather on his side, a storm of numbers, interests, and corporate reputations. John was spending more time in meetings than he would have liked, and the glass walls of his office, which had once felt like conquests to him, were now fences. A billion-dollar merger between Walker and Sons and an international conglomerate had been in the works for months. It was the biggest deal of the decade and would attract investors from around the world, cementing John's status as a global powerhouse. But everything began to shake when, in an informal meeting with board representatives, someone blurted out a seemingly innocent sentence. "I understand that you've been involved with a teacher from a modest neighborhood. That doesn't fit with the new profile of the company." The tone was polite disdain, but the venom was clear. John didn't respond right away, but something in him hardened. Days later, at a meeting with the executive committee, the threat came in a more direct form. One of the foreign partners, with a sharp voice and diplomatic tone, said, "John, we know that your personal life is yours, but this merger requires a solid image, strategic alliances. We need to avoid noise. The press is merciless." Another added, "We are not saying that you need to break up, but she can no longer appear publicly associated with you. Not at the community center, not on social media, not in public mentions. The image needs to be protected." John felt his blood boil. Sarah was anything but noise. It was truth, affection, reconstruction. But in that environment, where emotions were seen as weakness and love as distraction, it seemed that everything he felt for her was considered a miscalculation. "Are you asking me to hide the only part of my life that makes me feel human?" he asked, his voice restrained but heavy. There was silence. "We are asking you to preserve what we have built so far," one of them replied, cold as a clause in a contract. John left the meeting with firm steps, but inside the ground was already beginning to crack. That night, he didn't tell Sarah what had happened. He wanted to protect her from the coldness of that world, but she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the rigidity in his gaze. "Did something happen?" he asked, as they prepared dinner together, Ethan playing with pots and pans on the kitchen floor. "Nothing that can't be fixed." Sarah didn't insist. She knew that John was like those old pianos, beautiful on the outside, but full of internal strings that, when out of tune, needed time and care to get back to sounding. Days later, however, the truth came out. Sarah received a call from the community center coordinator. The board had decided to let her go from the project due to image conflicts. Her heart sank, not because of her job, but because of the way everything seemed to be falling apart when it was finally starting to blossom. "Was John the one who allowed this?" she asked the coordinator. He tried to avoid it, but the decision came from above. That same day, Sarah waited for John at home. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, Ethan on her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. When he came in, he noticed the different air, the heavy silence. "They took me out of the community center," he said bluntly. John closed his eyes for a moment. "I tried to stop it. I swear I tried." She nodded, but there was hurt in her voice. "You didn't have to stop it. You just had to choose." John came over, sitting next to her. "I'm trying to keep everything together, Sarah. The merger, it's the biggest deal of my life." She looked at him steadily. "And me? What am I in this equation? A reputational risk?" He took her hands in his. "You're everything, but they don't see that. They're willing to cut me off from everything if I insist." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to contain the pain. So I'll make it easy. I'll walk away. But please, don't ask me to explain this to Ethan. Her voice broke at the end. John tried to respond, but the words seemed too small compared to what he was losing. The next morning, John walked into his conference room earlier than usual. The mirrored glass reflected a man I no longer recognized. His expression was tense, his gaze lost, as if something inside him was slowly breaking apart. On the table, the merger contracts were ready for signature. 100 pages of projections, clauses, earnings and expansions. But the real weight wasn't in the paper, it was in the choices the document required. When the partners arrived, John was already sitting at the head of the table, his jacket draped over the chair and his sleeves rolled up. Before we begin, I want to say something. His voice was firm but charged with emotion. I've spent my whole life being the man everyone expected me to be. Cold, efficient, calculating, and I've been good at it. But in the last few months, I've discovered that being good at business doesn't mean being whole. And I'm not whole. The eyes around him met, suspicious. Are you saying you're not going to sign? One of the executives ventured. John took a deep breath. I'm saying I'm not going to sacrifice the only real thing I've found in years for a fusion that requires me to be another man. The room was silent, as if everyone was waiting for him to back down, as if this were just another negotiating ploy. But John continued. Sarah is not an image problem. She is the reason I still believe I can be more than just a name in a boardroom. If this is a risk to you, accept my resignation. A murmur broke out. Are you resigning from your own company? Asked one of the founders of the investment group. John replied with a half smile. I am reintegrating into my own life. And with that, he got up from the table, gathered his things, and left without looking back. It was the end of an era, and the beginning of a truth he was no longer willing to negotiate. Hours later, he stopped at Sarah's door. His hair was wind-blown and his eyes were tired, but there was peace in his expression. She opened the door, surprised, still wearing her paint-stained apron from the community center, where she had returned to volunteer. John, he smiled, and his eyes filled with emotion. You asked me the other day what you were in this equation. It took me too long to give you the answer. Sarah took a step back, confused. What happened? John took her hands. I cancelled the merger, or rather, I chose you. I chose us because I discovered something more valuable than any contract, something that doesn't need clauses, only courage. Sarah silently let the tears fall without holding back. For once, she didn't need to be strong, and John didn't need to be rational. Later, sitting on the couch with Ethan playing between them, John revealed everything. The meetings, the pressure, the blackmail disguised as advice. Sarah listened in silence, squeezing his hand. Do you know what the hardest part of all this is? She said, her voice low. It's not being fired or being called a mistake. It's the fear of believing in something good and losing it. John leaned closer, his expression serene. The difference is that now, you're not alone anymore. And if you're afraid, that's okay, because I am too. But what we're building here is worth the risk. She rested her head on his shoulder. Ethan, oblivious to the depth of that conversation, pointed to a cartoon on the television, and in that moment, there were no more mergers, no broken pasts, no masks. There was a family under construction, with pauses, with flaws, with truth. The newly found tranquility began to unravel in the following weeks. Richard, who had maintained a respectful demeanor until then, began to show an increasingly invasive urgency regarding his relationship with Ethan. He called frequently, showed up unexpectedly at the community center, and even waited uninvited at Sarah's door. At first, she tried to remain calm. You said you wanted to take it slow, that you would understand his timing, she reminded him firmly. But Richard began to push the boundaries, mixing false care with a possessive tone that Sarah knew all too well. He's my son too, Sarah. You can't stop me from being a part of his life. And to tell you the truth, I think we should talk about us too." Her eyes widened in surprise. "The two of us? Richard, you abandoned me. I raised Ethan alone." He crossed his arms, smirking. "And you're still alone, aren't you?" Richard's words hit her like poisoned darts, not because of the truth, but because of the manipulation. John, upon noticing his ex's increased presence, tried to remain calm, but it was clear that his patience was beginning to wear thin. "He's not just trying to get back together with Ethan. He's trying to reclaim a space that you didn't give him, Sarah," he said one day, after Richard had left flowers on her doorstep with a note saying, "To remember the good old days." Sarah felt her stomach churn. "It's like he wants to erase everything I've done on my own. Like all he has to do is show up for me to go back to who I was before." John grabbed her by the shoulders and looked into her eyes. "You're not that woman anymore, and he has no right to make you doubt that." Sarah nodded with tears in her eyes. "But he insists, and I don't want Ethan to grow up seeing this as normal." Things got worse when Richard tried to pick Ethan up from daycare without warning. The teacher immediately called Sarah, who arrived breathless and shocked. He said he was the father, that he could take him. Sarah confronted Richard on the sidewalk. "Have you completely lost your mind? You can't just show up at daycare out of the blue and want to take my son," he replied, unmoved. "Our son, and I can. Legally, I have the right." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Are you really willing to force this? To take him against my will?" Richard leaned closer, his voice lower but threatening. "If you keep pushing me away, I'll sue you. And when I do, you won't be the one to decide who he ends up with." That was the last straw. Sarah backed away, feeling the ground disappear from under her. She went to John that same night and, with a trembling voice, said, "He's going to try to take my son away from me. I know what he's like. He smiles, but it's like acid." John listened to everything in attentive silence, but his gaze was already filled with contained fury. "He won't make it. I know this type of man. They count on fear. They count on your guilt. But now, you're not alone anymore." The next day, John called his personal lawyer and arranged a meeting with Sarah. "We'll regularize everything. You'll have legal custody, and we'll propose an agreement in which he can see Ethan, yes, but with rules, with schedules, and most importantly, with respect." Sarah nodded, but her voice cracked. "What if he fights for shared custody?" John answered without hesitation. "Then he'll have to fight against me too." And he added, "I want to be his father officially. I want Ethan to have my name too. If you let me, I want to adopt him." Sarah was silent for a moment, overcome by intense emotion. And then, crying, she whispered, "You're already his father, John. All that's left is for the world to recognize it." The days following Richard's threat were lived as if Sarah were on edge. She locked the doors more tightly, avoided going out alone, and compulsively checked her cell phone. Ethan, sensitive as only children can be, began to react to his mother's tension with nighttime cries and simple, heartbreaking questions. "Mommy, is the bad boy coming back?" Sarah tried to smile and rock her son, but there were nights when she couldn't sleep. John, always by her side, reinforced his presence with silent actions. He installed discreet security cameras, hired a lawyer specializing in family law, and began to put together with Sarah a dossier documenting everything: messages, unexpected visits, testimonies from the daycare. It wasn't just a legal effort. It was an attempt to give her back control of her own story. "You've spent too long being strong on your own. Now it's my turn to protect you." Even with a heavy heart, Sarah felt something new growing inside her. Trust, not only in John, but in herself. With each conversation with the lawyer, with each limit imposed on Richard, with each firm gesture she managed to sustain, a part of her was reborn. But the emotional trigger came one Saturday, when Richard appeared at the gate during Ethan's music class, shouting his name and demanding to see him. Sarah ran to the gate, her eyes flashing. "You have no right to do this in front of the children." Richard, visibly upset, replied, "And you have no right to take my son away from me. I'm going to take him away from you, Sarah. Justice is on my side." John arrived minutes later, warned by one of the monitors. When he came across the scene, he approached without losing his calm, but with the firmness of someone who would no longer accept abuse. "It's over, Richard. From now on, everything will be done through the courts. Don't set foot here again without permission. If you do come, you'll come with a bailiff and with your time limited." After this episode, Sarah collapsed emotionally. She cried for hours in John's arms, sitting on the couch, shaking with exhaustion and panic. "He wants to erase everything I've built, as if I were just a woman he left in the past. He wants me to be fragile again." John, with moist eyes, whispered as he hugged her, "But you were never fragile, Sarah, and now you have someone to remind you of that every day." That night, John stayed. They slept together, but this time there was no kiss or desire, just two bodies intertwined by the need for mutual care. Ethan woke up in the middle of the night, and upon seeing the two of them together, lay down between them naturally. John hugged him reflexively. Sarah looked at that scene and knew, without a doubt, that this was the home she had always dreamed of. Not one with new walls or expensive furniture, but one made of presence, connection, and love. From that moment on, the relationship between John and Sarah grew even deeper. He started sleeping with them at least 3 times a week. In the late afternoons, the three of them would walk around town like a little family. Ethan in the middle, holding hands with them both, telling made-up stories, laughing out loud. Sarah started smiling more often, even though the lawsuit was ongoing. "You know what gives me strength?" she said one night as they walked together along the shore of Lake Michigan. "It's knowing that even when things get tough, I have somewhere to come back to. I have you." John squeezed her hand gently. "And you gave me a home too. Before you, I slept on expensive sheets, but I woke up cold inside. Now, I feel warm, even when the world outside is cold." The court case dragged on for several weeks, filled with tension and silent but revealing hearings. Sarah's firm and sensitive lawyer presented enough evidence to ensure that any contact between Richard and Ethan could only happen under psychological supervision in a neutral environment, and with the supervision of a social worker. Richard tried to fight back, threatened to appeal, tried to disqualify Sarah in front of the judge, but the reports from the daycare, the aggressive messages, and her history of abandonment were stronger. At the end of the last hearing, Sarah sat on the courthouse steps and broke down in tears. John knelt in front of her, holding her face in his hands. "You won, Sarah. Not just in court. You won the woman who doubted her own strength." She smiled through her tears. "No, I only became her because you held me when I almost forgot who I was." A few weeks later, on a quiet fall afternoon, John took her to a state park outside Chicago, where they had prepared a picnic to celebrate. Ethan ran through the dead leaves, laughing, while John spread a blanket on the ground. Sarah arrived carrying a basket of bread, fruit, and an inexpensive wine they had picked out together at the local market. They sat side by side, the sky tinged with gold, and the world seeming for a moment perfect. Then John turned to her, his eyes welling up and his voice breaking. "I've spent my life building buildings with perfect pillars, flawless structures, but none of them had a soul." He pulled a small ring from his pocket with a simple stone, perhaps quartz, on a silver band. "Today, I want to build a home with you and with Ethan." Sarah couldn't hold back her tears. "Yes," she said before he could even formally ask. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The wedding was not a grand affair. It was an intimate ceremony in the garden of the community center where it all began. Children from the project played an out-of-tune violin. Ethan ran in with the rings tied to a stuffed animal, and Teresa, the coordinator, improvised a moving speech about new beginnings and courage. Sarah wore a simple white dress with flowers in her hair and the smile of someone who finally felt whole. John cried during the exchange of vows. "I choose you every day, even when the world wants me to hide. I choose you because you are the sound that was missing in my silent life." And Sarah replied, "You saw me when all I wanted was to be invisible. You loved me when all I knew was to survive." When they kissed, it was as if the entire past bowed before that moment. There was no more room for pain, only for what was finally true. Months later, with John's support and an anonymous donation he made to the city, Sarah founded a small music school in a poor neighborhood in Chicago. The school was named after her grandmother, Gracie's Place, and quickly became a landmark in the community. Ethan grew up strong, sweet, passionate about the piano, and fascinated by picture books. He was legally adopted by John in a ceremony at the registry office where the judge congratulated them both for their courage and their choice. The father is not always the one who gives birth. Sometimes it's the one who stays. Sarah kept the phrase on a folded piece of paper, along with the receipt from the first grocery store purchase that had started it all. One day, sitting on the porch with John and Ethan in her arms, she pointed to the paper and said, "I bought diapers and formula, and I got a home." John smiled, kissed the top of her head, and added, "And I got the chance to really love." Time passed with the serenity of someone who has faced the greatest storms and learned to dance even in the rain. John, who used to measure his days by numbers and meetings, now marked them by Ethan's drawings on the refrigerator door, by the songs Sarah composed on nights when the city slept, and they, awake, invented new dreams. Sarah, in turn, blossomed with each class, with each child who learned their first musical note, with each mother who said, "You inspire me." The love between her and John was not made of grand daily gestures. It was made of hands that met in silence, of glances exchanged between the stove and the school door, of knowing that even on difficult days, they no longer had to walk alone. One night, after putting Ethan to bed, they lay side by side on the porch, watching the stars. The breeze was warm, and the distant sound of music coming from a nearby window lulled them. Sarah turned to him, her face illuminated by the yellow light of the street lamp. "You know, sometimes I still wonder if all this is real." John smiled, turning as well. "I wonder too, but then you smile at me, and the whole world seems easier." She rested her head on his shoulder and lay there, silent, just listening to his heart beat slowly. That was it. There was no more rush, no more fear. There was a present built from the pain, the truth, and the love they had chosen to live. Years later, in a school essay, Ethan wrote, "My father chose me. He didn't have to be there for me at the beginning, because he chose to be there for everything that came after." Sarah read the text with tears in her eyes, sitting in the audience at the end-of-year performance, while John hugged her proudly. That boy, who had once been carried in the arms of a tired and lonely mother, now stood on stage with a sparkle in his eyes and a song in his heart. And there, in front of everyone, he dedicated his song to two people who taught me that family is those who stay, who listen, who care. No one could hold back their tears, not even John, who was trying to hide his tears, like someone cleaning his glasses. After the event, they walked hand in hand through the streets of Chicago. The city was in a festive mood, with lights in the windows and the smell of fresh bread in the air. They stopped in front of the old supermarket where it all began. Sarah looked at the window and smiled. "They still sell formula and diapers." John laughed, pulling her by the waist. "But now we buy to donate." Ethan, in between them, jumped up and down with a toy in his hand, unaware that in that simple place the most beautiful story of all had been born. And as they walked down the street, embraced by the warm night, they knew, without needing to say it, that they had found what so many people spend their entire lives, searching for an unexpected love, strong enough to change everything.